Good evening. Welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Last night, we played you our interview with President Trump from Helsinki. Part of that interview has made headlines today. People are upset about it. It has nothing, by the way, to do with Vladimir Putin or Mother Russia. It has to do with the nation of Montenegro, which, by the way, is smaller than the state of Connecticut. Montenegro has fewer residents than the District of Columbia. It's a relatively poor place. It has no critical natural resources and limited strategic significance. Few Americans could find it on a map or name its capital or its president. That's not a slur against Montenegro. Apparently, it's a nice place, but those are the facts about Montenegro. From an American perspective, it's not an important country. And yet suddenly, because of an act of Congress that few people noticed, Montenegro has profound significance to every American. Since last year, Montenegro has been a member of the NATO alliance. That means that if Montenegro ever finds itself in a war, our military is pledged to defend it. That's called a defense guarantee. Defense guarantees don't seem like a big deal until suddenly they are. That's how the First World War started. 37 million casualties later, the world began to rethink the wisdom of treaties like that. But the lesson seems to have been lost since. In our interview with President Trump in Finland, we thought it might be worth having a conversation, or starting one, about America's obligations to NATO. So we asked a simple question. Why is it in our interest to defend the territorial integrity of Montenegro? Why should our soldiers fight and die on its behalf? Here's the exchange we had. So membership in NATO obligates the members to defend any other member that's attacked. So let's say Montenegro, which joined last year, is attacked. Right. Why should my son go to Montenegro to defend it from attack? Why is that? I understand
what you're saying. I've asked the same question. You know, Montenegro is a tiny country with very strong people.
Yeah, I'm not against Montenegro or Albania.
No, by the way, they're very strong people. They're very aggressive people. They may get aggressive, and congratulations, you're in World War III. Now, I understand that, but that's the way it was set up.
So that's not a definitive answer, obviously, but the president clearly had been thinking about it, and good for him. Presidents are supposed to wonder about things like that. Serious countries ought to have debates like that. The U.S. has to defend Montenegro? Really? Why is that? Is there a good reason? Let's hear it. That's the conversation we should be having. But the guardians of our public conversation are not serious people. They are hacks and buffoons. For wondering about our defense guarantee with Montenegro, Trump is being denounced for treason. For asking the question, we're accused of taking orders from Vladimir Putin. What do the Russians have on Tucker Carlson? Asked longtime CNN star Kathy Griffin. Her former network did an entire segment this afternoon suggesting that Americans somehow have some sort of moral obligation to lay down their lives for Montenegro. Here's part of it.
Yet again raising serious doubts about whether he would honor Article 5 of the NATO Charter if it came down to it. It's a cornerstone of the alliance. An armed attack on one nation is an attack on all. This time the president questioned whether the United States should honor its agreement when it comes to NATO's newest member, Montenegro.
So the argument apparently is that because Montenegro has about 20 non-combatants in Afghanistan right now, we, the U.S., has an eternal obligation to spend American money and lives defending Montenegro's borders. That is idiotic, which is to say perfect for cable news. In real life, a defense guarantee is not something you'd enter into lightly. It's like promising a friend to take care of his kids if he dies. It's a solemn commitment, and you would not make it unless you planned to keep it. So the question is, do we plan to keep it? Do we really plan to defend Montenegro? Or many of the other NATO members? How about Estonia? How about Slovakia? You ready to have your kids die in those countries? The U.S. government is ready to send them. We've promised to do that. NATO was created almost 70 years ago for a specific and noble purpose, keeping the Soviets from invading Western Europe. It worked, thank God. But the Soviet Union no longer exists, and it hasn't existed for almost 30 years. NATO, meanwhile, is still around, and it's getting bigger. Why is that? And more to the point, is it serving America's interests, or is it imperiling them? Those are vital questions. Official Washington does not want to answer them or talk about them. They're trying to crush anyone who asks. We are not intimidated, obviously. Joining us tonight is Philippe Reines, the former Hillary Clinton spokesman. Earlier today, he suggested we were working for Vladimir Putin for daring to ask about NATO and Montenegro. So it's a really serious question, because defense guarantees are serious promises. Why would the United States promise to defend Montenegro?
Well, The NATO treaty has kept the peace since World War II. I don't want your son to fight in Montenegro. I don't want your son to fight in Germany or any other of the 29 NATO countries. But you are presenting NATO as something likely to trigger a war, when NATO, in fact, has been what has avoided war. And while the Soviet Union has fallen, the Russians are incredible. I know when I say Russians...
Hold on. The reason I brought up Montenegro, and you suggested there was some Putin-related reason that I did, but there was a much more prosaic, obvious reason for bringing it up, which is it just joined NATO.
Yeah.
And
so at what level is a country not big enough to fight for? And let's also remember...
Well, I don't know. What's the American interest that would be preserved by sending my son to go fight in Montenegro? It's a serious question.
I saw your interview last night, and
what's the answer? Speak slowly so I can understand.
The answer is NATO and the collective defense, as it's called, which you know, is the most likely thing to keep the peace than not.
But let's say if there's no peace, but hold on, let's say that Russia moves against Montenegro. I'm not hoping for that. I hope they don't, but they might. Why would a critical American interest be served in going to war over that?
At what point is a country big enough?
Well, how about this point? How about Montenegro? I mean, that's why I gave a very specific example.
Well, you diminished their contribution to Afghanistan.
I'm not attacking them. I think it's great that they've got 20 non-combatants in Afghanistan, I guess. Actually, I feel sorry for them. I don't think we should have...
Well, they've contributed even before NATO.
That's great. But that's not the point. Are you suggesting that we owe them a defense guarantee because they're participating in Afghanistan?
I'm not looking at Montenegro itself. I'm looking at the full 29 countries that make up NATO.
That's how bad decisions get made, when people don't look at the specifics. That's why I am looking at the specifics.
Well, here are the specifics. How many times has the collective defense ever been triggered?
Okay, once.
Once, and when was that?
It was after 9/11.
And it was a sign of solidarity.
I think it's great.
It's never happened.
This is not 9/11.
I think
the World War.
This is not Archduke Ferdinand.
Actually happened.
I know.
It's not. It's merely, look, the fact is that we are obligated to defend all these countries: Slovakia, Albania, Turkey. What would happen if Israel attacked Turkey? That's not a crazy possibility. You could easily see a terror group, Hamas, whatever, backed by Turkey. Israel retaliates. Suddenly, we're obligated to attack Israel? How would that work?
It's not every time anyone fires a shot at anyone else that we go to war.
But
otherwise, we would have been in 18 wars in the last 50 years.
Could you imagine a scenario where I easily could.
No.
Really?
We would never be in a shooting war with Israel.
Of course we wouldn't be. But under the terms of Article 5, you could see an obligation.
But the terms have never been triggered because the point of the terms are to keep the peace, and it has been successful.
Okay, but
is Montenegro the tipping point between NATO working and not?
Here's just a newsflash.
Yep.
The intent of something is not always consistent with the result of it. In other words, we do things hoping for one outcome and very often get an entirely different outcome. And that's why we need to enlarge our minds and imagine what could happen when we start making reckless
security guarantees. But we didn't just create NATO yesterday.
No, we didn't.
We created NATO decades ago, and we know the history.
So what's the point? What is it? I mean, let's be really specific. So NATO was created to keep the Soviets from invading Western.
NATO, the original NATO, which I believe was 12 countries, was to keep the Soviet Union in check.
Correct. That's right. From invading Western Europe. Great goal.
Which, by the way, has worked really well.
Amen. I totally agree.
Europe was war-torn since the beginning of Europe.
Couldn't agree more. I love NATO. I grew up loving NATO.
Something is working.
Okay.
Something got us through the
But
Cold War.
the world has completely changed. So maybe the people in Washington are so ossified and dumb, which is true, that they're failing to account for the total realignment of everything. The world is completely different from what it was in August of '91 when the Soviet Union disappeared.
So are you saying that Montenegro shouldn't be part of it, or NATO should stop?
I'm saying
we should pull out of NATO.
I'm not saying we should pull out of NATO. I'm saying we should have an adult conversation.
I don't know who number 28 was, but
but you're making impossible, with reckless charges of treason, the conversation America needs, which is, what is the point of this? Is the main adversary we face in the world stage
I don't believe Donald Trump bumping into the president of Montenegro several months ago was any kind of coded
How
message.
far does this go? I mean, like, what
it was? I think people picked up on it because there was only a 1 in 28 chance of picking Montenegro.
But what you're doing
but
is
that's not the point.
Like, I watch these other channels and they're like, Trump this, Trump that. It's like, actually, every American voting for Trump or not has an interest in answering the question, what's the point of this? And no one can answer the question.
That's not true. I'm trying to answer the question, which is NATO has been part of our own defense. It is not.
You're giving me a history lesson. I want to know about
But the history is relative. I mean, if you don't learn from
history. So they're going to prevent Russia from doing what? Russia is,
I know you hate when I say it, but Russia is being aggressive. I won't say a word about the election. Russia is being aggressive again. Russia is being aggressive militarily.
So let's say they took
Russian
over
bombers are buzzing us over Alaska. We have Russian ships and airplanes
NATO
menacing
hasn't
us.
prevented any of that. It's kind of
How
weird.
do you know?
I don't know. You're saying that Russia's. So bottom line.
Maybe they are incredibly afraid of the Montenegrins.
But maybe if Russia were to invade one of these countries, do you think, very simple question, it would be worth your neighbors, my kids, going to fight Russia for the sake of the territorial integrity of these countries?
I don't want to be the Dem that just repeats myself 4 times, but I firmly believe that it is NATO that has prevented that. In 4 years of the State Department, I went to NATO 4 times in Belgium. I understand.
Look, NATO's, again, you should be a history teacher. I'm just asking, like, how about tomorrow this happens? Don't you think Americans
But there have been
what
events.
percentage of Americans
Ukraine,
think they want their kids to die defending Slovakia? Seriously, big percentage, would you say?
I don't know. I know that I just outside met Leo and Michelle from Atlanta, Georgia. They're a big fan of yours, and I think that they understand that NATO is important. They might understand why Montenegro,
they think
and they might agree that there's a Montenegro meltdown.
But outside all the dumb people working in nonprofits, the think tank people in charge of our foreign policy who literally are responsible for wrecking the world, outside that group of people, does anybody think it's worth dying for Slovakia? Not one person.
Well, I think people are enjoying the freedom that has been provided without having to spend too much time worrying about how it's come, which is the American way that it should be.
Philippe, good to see you.
It is good to be back.
Thank you. Lou Dobbs, host, of course, Lou Dobbs tonight on Fox Business, one of the wisest people on television. He joins us tonight. Do you think, Lou, America's obligation to defend the territorial integrity of Montenegro?
I think that the president is not getting the credit he deserves for raising the issue of realigning NATO, because as you worry about whether we will defend NATO, it seems to be the reaction, at least of Philip, that NATO has saved the Western civilization. It's really an odd discussion to me in this respect, if I may say, Tucker. The President of the United States is the one who, in his campaign, started talking about reorienting NATO, talking about the fact you talked about Washington being ossified and dumb. This is a president who came in with bright ideas, who is attacked from every element of the establishment and those who are invested deeply in the status quo, including NATO. But the reality is that as we watch cable television today, the folks you were talking about on CNN are really neocons of casual convenience.
Exactly.
They are just thrilled to be talking about the United States defending the poor folks of Montenegro against the onslaught of mad Russians. This is beyond the pale. And the fact is, the real answer lies in we have a president who saw all of this years ago, who is driving this discussion because he can't get Congress, he can't get through the national media to the important issues. What is NATO doing? Why are they expanding to 29 nations, many of them small, and whether small or large, not particularly responsible in meeting the demands that are required of 2% of GDP for defense spending? We are actually being called upon to defend all of NATO, irrespective of the money they pay or their own fighting capabilities.
Because we deserve it. We have an altruistic obligation to only act when it's not in our interest. Have you ever noticed that they're very enthusiastic for war, but never wars that might actually benefit the United States? Ever. Any war that we might actually have an interest in, no, can't do that, because we're bad.
You've put it perfectly. We are compelled by some mysterious force to be altruistic, to act even against our own national interests. One could argue that invading Iraq, as the president has pointed out, and losing all of those lives and losing all of that money in the trillions was not in our interest, because really we didn't do much with the people, both in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, who were responsible for September 11th, and that was the incipient point of the conflict. It is difficult for some to remember. But the president has put it straightforwardly. He wants rationality. He wants things to make sense. He has talked endlessly over the last 2 years, to sometimes no avail, that we need smart government. We need smart people in government. We need brains. We need verb. And we need people committed to changing this status quo that could strangle this country as well as Western Europe. if we're not careful.
Give me a war that protects America, and I'll support it. The others,
Amen,
we're
brother.
supporting. Lou, great to see you. Thank you.
Great to see you.
Sexist, racist, traitor, Nazi. The left is running out of epithets for the president. What's next? You know what's next.